Thank you very much. This is a special meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee. It's Tuesday, May the 31st. We have a quorum. Mr. Smith, Mr. Peretz, myself, Bernard Parks, is the chair. This meeting is primarily set up for the FSR, the final FSR for the year. And so we'd ask the CAOs, CLA to come up to walk us through this. Also, colleagues, I think we've already addressed item 2 in a previous meeting, that we can move that on consent.
You get distorted looks here.
No, this is the controller's report. I thought we already dealt with that. Well, she said she's not going to send the money unless we vote on it.
No, this is basically her coming back, telling her what she's asking for.
Okay.
So you need to.
Let me correct that. We have not seen this before. Let me ask for consent on item 2. Any concern? Did I miss something?
No.
All right. Okay. So we've not missed it. We have item 1.
And I'll just read item 2 is basically the city controller report relative to authorization for year-end reserve fund borrowing. So this will be on consent. Take it.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. And then we'll go to item 1, which is CEO report relative to fiscal.
Sit and laugh and not tell me what you're asking.
The fiscal year 2010-11 year-end financial status report and addendums relative to Bureau Street Services, and we also had an addendum report as well.
Okay. And we have 2 revised 6 and 16.
That is correct. I will touch on those as we hit the relevant discussion. Melissa Krantz, Office of the CAO. So before you is the 4th financial status report. In our previous reports, we have identified shortfalls, both in revenue and expenditures, totaling about $276 million. And through various financial status reports and the operational plan and the alternative plan, we have eliminated these deficits to a large extent. By the 3rd FSR, with those recommendations, our deficit standing at that time was about $4.1 million. However, with additional expenditure reductions by departments, we have eliminated the citywide deficit. We do have shortfalls within individual department accounts and non-departmental fund accounts, which will require recommendations to address. Okay. So on page 2 of the report, we have a discussion on the revenue budget, and this has been unchanged from what was discussed during the mayor's proposed budget. Our shortfall, which was previously reported in the 3rd FSR of being $85 million short, is now $75 million. So that's an improvement from the 3rd FSR. However, we still do need to address that shortfall. On page 3, we discuss the expenditure shortfalls. In the 1st FSR, we had 4 departments reporting shortfalls in funding in excess of $10 million. That was the city attorney, the general services department, fire and police departments. And these departments will have received or will be now recommended to receive additional appropriations to allow them to complete the year within budget. Additionally, we have the Bureau of Contract Administration, which will require an appropriation for them to complete work at LAWA. And we have some new shortfalls as a result of the coalition approved amendments that have reduced furlough day savings. So all totaled, we have about $9.7 million in unsolved salary deficits. On top of that, we have coalition furlough savings reductions, and the report says it's about 1.5. It's now about 1.7. That reflects the coalition units that approved with the release of the FSR, and as well as MOU 3 and 18, which approved subsequent to the release of the FSR. We also have expense account deficits. These were addressed in the 3rd FSR. These include the election materials for the clerk's office, fuel costs for GSD, bank fees for the treasurer's office, and the solid waste fee lifeline subsidy. So all totaled, we need about $17.8 million in appropriations to departments and non-departmental accounts. So in the 2nd FSR, as well as the alternative plan, we had identified savings, which we had then swept to the Reserve for Economic Uncertainty. And with additional recommendations in this FSR, we will have a balance of about $75 million to address the remaining revenue shortfall. So that will allow us to complete the year within budget. On page 4, we have a reserve fund discussion. In the third FSR, our reserve fund was about $190 million. It's increased slightly to $193.8 million. Of that, we have the $120 in the emergency reserve and the $73 million in the contingency reserve. That puts us about 4.43% of the budget. And our goal, of course, is 5%. So.
Let me just ask on that paragraph, we had asked before that when we comment on reserve, that we have the
I'm sorry.
the budget stability account. We had that. I thought we had asked that in the future, whenever we have the reserve, we have this stability account added to that.
The budget, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So were there any questions on the summary section?
No, not
Okay. If you'd like, we could go to the discussion section, and in the discussion section, we can touch on the recommendations for the department.
So we're going to jump past the individual recommendations and go to the departments. Is that what you said?
Yes, if that's all right, or would you rather just go
No,
through?
the department,
Okay.
but in your department reports, you comment on how they relate to the recommendations.
Okay, well, what I'll do is I'll also discuss the recommendations at that same time. So the discussion section begins on page 17 with Department of Aging. They had a year-end surplus of $632,000 projected for their salaries general account, of which $623 is in special funds. They did reprogram about $260,000 in grant funds, and the report does mention that there's about $183 in older workers training program funds that are of concern because they could not be reprogrammed. We have received notice that they might be able to reprogram this. So that leaves about $70,000 that will not be able to be reprogrammed.
But I think they mentioned to us, it seems, in the budget hearings, that when these funds go back, they're eligible to go back and re-request them.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. Animal Services, they have a $154,000 deficit, which is largely attributed to the coalition changes with reduced furlough savings. They were able to address about $97,000 of that internally, and we also have a recommendation to appropriate funds from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty. And this is just for the initial coalitions units that agreed. We also have recommendations in the addendum to cover the subsequent units that
And
approved.
let me ask you, as we go through this, I'm going to have a number of requests that when we're moving funds that cover deficit, that we show them as loans to be paid back next year.
Okay, now my understanding is for the coalition agreements that departments were told they'd be made whole. Is that not correct?
What is that agreement?
Oh, I think there was the expectation that once those agreements or those MOUs would be approved, that departments would be made whole, because that would be, a salary hole that was generated that's sort of somewhat outside of their control. And so I think we view that this is sort of a good faith for those departments, that basically if employees no longer have to complete those furloughs, then it does create a salary hole that we feel that we should
Well, how do we
make whole.
distinguish a real deficit from one that you say that's imposed because they're also intermingled? And it appears, at least on the second department, that they were able to cut that deficit at over half.
We have asked departments to address the shortfalls internally, and I just wanted to clarify that this money is not coming from the reserve fund. It's coming from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty, and that is money that we had also swept from departments when they had realized savings in their departments, and we swept that money as part of the alternative plan and the operational plan, in recognition of the fact that we'd probably have these expenditures down the line that would need to be addressed with these savings.
I'm just trying to find the consistency that if we're saying that they have an expectation, then how on the report we're saying 97,000 of this is coming from their own funds.
Right.
And so did that expectation not cover them?
That expectation did cover them. They just were not able to absorb the full cost internally. So where departments were able to absorb the full cost internally, there is no appropriation. Other departments, we have to make them whole in order to cover the expenditures through the
I think
year.
that's the point I'm trying to make, is that if some departments are making it on their own and without a transfer, then the departments that we're saying they have an expectation that we're going to find the money for them seems inconsistent.
Certainly not fair.
So, I mean, that's why I was saying is that it appears is that we got to come up with a fair way that says that you either, if you're deficit, that you're going to pay it back as a loan, or you're going to give everybody the same option. So right off the bat, we have a major inconsistency that Animal Services is coming up with over half through their own funds, yet we're saying other departments that didn't quite make that commitment get a free ride. So I need some consistency on how you're going to address that. So either they have an expectation, or they don't have an expectation, or we ignored the expectation, at least for Animal Services.
I think we have some challenges when we look at what has occurred the current fiscal year. Part of what we are trying to sort of close, and we have the recommendations in the report, is basically offset that big revenue piece, the big part of that, being that 53 million, and some other change to bring to a total of 75. And so through a number of actions that have occurred over the course of the year, basically what we're saying here, that we've closed. Now, I think part of the difficulty as we look through at each department, some were able to, through their own internal actions or through the managed hiring process, they were able to generate savings to close whatever shortfalls they might have had. Other departments, like Animal Services, where they have not. Part of the issue for those departments that have not, and then you have to go and look at the coalition agreement and those units that have ratified. So with the ratification of those units, did that then create a salary hole? And then we have departments where, yes, there were shortfalls because the budget wasn't implemented as adopted back in July, and they created problems, or there could have been some other issues or things that came out through the year, which then they were not able to close the full shortfall. As far as advice on consistency, I think given the challenges that we've had this year, the recommendations that are included, I think those at this point are fair. It's be kind of difficult for us to go back and then say, well, now this department, these things were all under your control, and now you're going to have to solve it. If you didn't, then we're going to take money from next year. And then so next year, those departments are going to be put into sort of a hole to begin with.
But let me just say that if a department, by using managed hiring or whatever funds, and the first one off the bat is Animal Services, and they were successful at reducing their deficit over half, how do you look at them and say, we took money that possibly could have been rolled over for their benefit and other activities, yet there's other departments that didn't do as well and have larger holes, and we're saying we'll just absorb that?
If I may add, this is the recommendation to appropriate funds is very consistent with what we had done with the operational plan. We had the EAA reduce furloughs, and there was discussion that we would make departments whole for the EAA reduced furlough savings, and we did do that as part of the operational plan. So the fact that we're giving an appropriation is consistent with what we had done this fiscal year for the other MOUs. What we have not done is given an appropriation to all departments that's requested it, largely because we don't have enough savings to cover all this additional impact of the MOU furloughs for all departments. So we had to prioritize those departments who just couldn't clear the final pay period payroll expenses. Ideally, it would have been nice if we could have made all the departments whole for this MOU impact, but we just didn't have the funding to do that.
Okay, I understand that, but my concern is, as we look at this process, and what we've been talking about is having people accountable for their budgets and not penalize those who do very well and find a way to close out their budget, and then others take their money because they didn't do as well. And so and I think that was what we all applauded the controller as to her decision to say, I'm only going to move a small portion to balance the book, and anything over 1%, we're going to have to ask the council. And so that was what we thought we were heading towards, is accountability of every general manager looking at their budget and making the right decisions and not relying on later, you guys are going to figure it out for them because they didn't quite maybe work as hard as another general manager. So that's right off the bat is what I have a concern with about an inconsistency, and not looking at animal services any differently than others. But if they found a way to close that gap, then the issue is that you're saying give them this amount of money, but what about those that just didn't make that same effort?
And perhaps it more had a lot to do with the timing of when the MOUs were approved. I mean, with the EAA agreements that came very early on the year, and it gave us the opportunity to do an operational plan. So, I mean, a lot of this is just necessary to get them appropriations in order to make, payroll time.
Yeah, and I'm not going back to mid-year or prior, where we made other judgments. We're just talking about closing out.
Okay.
Councilmember Ben Stout, the CAO. I think the other factors to consider is the makeup of the departments relative to which classifications they have, and also what furlough exemptions they had to begin with. So, for example, Animal Services was never charged with having the full set of 26 furlough days applied to everyone in their department. They, from the get-go, had a reduced amount of furloughs, and so then, even with the reduced salary savings to be generated from a reduced number of furloughs, their deficit won't be as high as other departments. They had kind of a larger contingency of their employees in the coalition agreements and taking the full 26 days. So those departments will, in essence, already be kind of inconsistent with Animal Services and with other departments. So there's a lot of different factors that result in why departments have a deficit, why departments need money outside of their own internal funds, and that's just the way it's been going.
Turn it around and look at the reverse. Animal Services had less furlough days, so they'd have less, in the sense when furloughs are being used, they'd have less cash to create a surplus. But yet, even with all that less, they still were able, through their resources, to cover over half of their deficit.
Yeah, and you also have to look at where those dollars are coming from. So for them, it's coming from the contractual services account, which I'm not familiar with exactly what contracts they have, but it could be things where maybe invoices will be paid the following year as opposed to this fiscal year.
So I think the uncertainty money came from a sweeping of everybody's accounts.
Yeah, and that happened, like Melissa stated, in the operational plan and through the alternative plan. So in essence, departments were trying to solve their own deficits in those instances, and through the various FSRs, we started taking those funds and putting them in the UB for economic uncertainty. And now it's time to pay these departments back for those sweeps that we made, and that's the intent here.
Yeah, it would seem to me that we know in each department what the variances are. We know which units are which, what got furloughs. So we could tag each department with a number and say up to that number, we will cover that. And if you've done a good job within your department and covering the most of it already, good for you, thank you. For those guys that haven't and aren't even close maybe, we shouldn't let them off the hook either, though. And so I think Mr. Parks wants to say there should be a loan of the dollars that we're backfilling into the department budgets today. Maybe we should loan everything above and beyond that furlough calculation, whatever the number is for each individual department. And that should be their loan amount then.
And to build on what you said, we have identified the source of these individual deficits. So some are ERIP funds that were supposed to be absorbed but weren't. Others, however, like this coalition, is a new imposition on departments that comes very at the end of the fiscal year. That makes it difficult for departments to take measures that allow them to realize savings. So, but like other things, you're right.
So you have bifurcated it enough that
yes, we call out the individual costs.
So when he says let's make it a loan, we could say let's make it a loan of everything above and beyond those.
Yes, I think our office would argue that we'd like to make departments whole, at least for the reduced furlough savings for coalitions, much as we had done for the EAA, but maybe for other issues not so.
So how would that practically work?
I can certainly call out the attention to which deficits are not which are not tied to the coalition.
Yep, so as we go through, Melissa can go through the numbers. So going back to animal services, I think the 154 that did come up since the third FSR, most of that was due, if not all of it was due to the coalition change in the furloughs. And so while animal service was able to make up a good portion of that, there still was a piece because of the coalition they were not. So that's why we were recommending that we move some money out of the UB.
The recommendation is that because it's all coalition.
It's all coalition, that is correct. Animal services was to complete the year within budget as of the third FSR.
Oh, you have any comments?
No, I'm fine with that.
All right, so we can move forward on that. Okay.
Building and safety, the department's projected to complete the year within budget. We have a recommendation to transfer $192,000 from their enterprise fund to the transportation expense account for mileage expenses as a result of increased in construction activity. For the CAO, we have recommendations to reappropriate $200,000 for actuarial studies and $150,000 for the Inspector General of Revenue Collection. City Attorney, they had a deficit of 8.1 million reported in the third FSR. They're now down to 3.6 million, of which 3.5 is in their salaries general account and 127 is in their contractual services account. This lower deficit reflects the $2 million that was appropriated from the Reserve for Economic Uncertainty to their salaries proprietary account. And after accounting for a recommendation to appropriate $1.8 million for the Consumer Protection Trust Fund, there is $1.7 million, and this deficit, which we have recommended an appropriation for, is attributable to ERIP retiree payouts that the department was not able to absorb.
Okay, let me ask on the first, that motion that we did earlier on proprietary, that money will be forthcoming at what timeline?
Are you talking about the reimbursement for the
We
proprietary?
did a motion recently.
I believe it was approved already, so.
So what is the timeline for that reimbursement from proprietaries?
Ida Rubio with the CAO's office. The reimbursement should be sometime within the first quarter of the next fiscal year.
Okay, and then on the, if I read this correctly, the consumer money is forthcoming at what timeline?
The city attorney's office would need to respond to that question.
Mr. Chairman, with respect to the consumer money, there is about 1.87 million that the timing of which is problematic for us. It's coming in the first quarter of next year, but we don't expect to receive at least all of it. Some of it may come in before the end of June, and we expect to receive it all before the end of next year. So we are asking in our communication to your committee request for a reserve fund loan of 1.87 in order to meet this year's obligations, but it will be fully refunded within the first quarter of the next year.
Okay, is that request for the 1.8 consumer money, or is that what's the ERIP money?
I beg your pardon?
What you're requesting, the loan, is dealing with the ERIP money?
No, it's the consumer money,
Okay,
the 17,200 account. We have a number of cases that were expected to settle by June 30th, and they're just a little late in processing the settlements through court.
If I may, I'm sorry,
I was just wondering, then how are you closing the 1.7 on the ERIP?
Oh, now the 1.7 was the one that we had a recommendation from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty as an appropriation.
Okay, but is that one that fits in the category that you mentioned earlier?
Well, if we were limiting the, just the straight appropriation to the coalition agreement, then no, that does not fit into that category.
So we expect the 1.8 consumer money coming in the first quarter,
Correct.
and the issue of the 1.7 is ERIP and not the coalition agreement. Is that right?
That is correct.
So the issue is that, what's the expectation of solving the 1.7?
Our understanding that was part of the operational plan that would be met by the city. I don't have any.
Here's the plan right there.
In the second FSR, So originally, we had money budgeted for the ERIP in the second FSR. We took an action to have direct departments to absorb that ERIP payout. And so some departments were not able to absorb that ERIP payout per the second FSR instruction. So this is our report recommends an appropriation from the UB reserve for economic uncertainty.
Okay. But that's inconsistent with our discussion earlier.
That's inconsistent with our discussion just now.
Okay. All right. Okay. But let me ask one other thing, is that when we look at attachment 12 on the report, and we look at the adopted budget versus the position authorities that start March and then go through the fiscal year, are those positions above the adopted budget is what's driving some of the deficit? Because it appears that the adopted budget 779, and end of March it's 901 with 38 vacancies.
I think what's driving some of the shortfall is they had less attrition than was anticipated in the operational plan. And then at the beginning of the year, they took that 10% reduction for the department as a whole for all elected offices. And they've been trying to mitigate that gap.
Okay. But can we mitigate that gap with 100-plus positions over the adopted budget?
So on attachment 12, the basic employment level report, what you see in the adopted budget, that 779, is the regular position authority.
Okay.
What's not included in that is resolution and any substitute positions that were adopted after July 1st. So the 939 is basically the total position authority that they have now with both regular and resolution authorities.
Okay, but what is the dollar amount? How much of it's covered on the dollar amount? Is only the 779?
They do have that'd be a question better answered by the department, but I do know we're given dollars with many of the resolution positions. However, what was driving part of their challenge for this year is just sort of the large dollar reduction that they received this year.
Not only that, but we've had, our attrition this year has come more in the second half of the year, so we're well below the 901 figure right now. I don't have the exact figure, I'm sorry. We've had about 28
this year.
28 vacancies total this year.
Or anticipated.
At least, or close to half of those came in the last few months. So that
That's
number.
what I'm trying to find out, is that if you started the TO with 779, and then you have some resolution authorities, and you're about three-quarters of the way in the fiscal year, and you're still over 900, when will you get those down to your budget level?
Well, we're down below 900 now. We've had a few more notifications of retirements and departures. I don't know. I can't give you the exact number now, but it's considerably lower than 900.
Have you hired during this year?
No.
We haven't hired anyone in 2 years. If I may, William Carter, Chief Deputy, and I wanted to add to what the CAO said and others. We went from a $95 million budget in 2009-10 to an $84 million budget in 2010-11. Just 2 weeks ago, this council approved a $95 million budget. So this council has recognized that the budget we had this year was grossly underfunded. We have tried our best. Our people have tried their best to get out of this ditch we're in. We've done everything possible. So by the end of this year, if we're only short $1.5 million or $3.5 million, I think this committee should recognize that our people have done an outstanding job with the 10% cut we were dealt. And on top of that, the COLAs and other things that were proposed because of the layoffs last year. All we're asking for is what is recommended in the final year-end FSR. But one other thing, as we put forth in our memo that was sent to the committee on Thursday, and we respectfully ask this, that we get a loan from the reserve fund of $1.8 million that we will repay back in the first quarter of next fiscal year, probably in July or August of this next fiscal year. We are responsible for another $1.8 million in unfair business practice penalties. We anticipating receiving the majority of that this fiscal year. We have negotiated, and I have them here, the negotiated settlements. I've listed them cases A through E, if anyone would like to see them. We have negotiated those penalties up to $1.8 million. Those are real settlement deals. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with the court and lawyers, sometimes you can't get the settlement monies in your hand by the end of this fiscal year. So it's somewhat arbitrary to get that money in the next 2 weeks. We do have it. We will have it, but probably not all of it by June 15th. That's the date we're shooting for. So what we are asking for today is a 1.8 loan from the 17,200 monies that we will repay.
Okay. Let me just tell you my concerns is that that's why we had this long discussion when we got started, so we could have a consistency. I agree that the $1.8 million loan for consumer protection, we hope that we do get that money back in the first quarter, just as we are supposed to get the proprietary funding back in the first quarter for the $2 million. But the 1.7 is also something that, as we go through this report, that also should be added as a next year's loan, so that we can basically, again, for consistency, reflect on how departments are going to stay within their budget.
Mr. Chair? I would just, for the record, say I heard that discussion, and I agree in terms of fairness, it would make sense. In terms of what it actually does to various departments in the city family, I'm not sure it actually winds up doing us any good. So I'm inclined to support the CAO's approach and recognize that we've been through some difficult times, and the departments that weren't able to meet these reductions, I'm inclined to allow them to get through for this 1 year.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, because I think for consistency, that what I'm looking for is that if we have reductions or people couldn't meet their issue of the coalition agreements, that's one thing, but it's been a full year of requests for these issues of ERIP. There's no secret that they were on the table, what, at FSR 1?
Number 2.
2. So that was, what, the first quarter, second quarter?
Yeah, it was December.
Yeah. So, but again, we may disagree on that, but I think that as we go through this, there's a number of departments that we're attempting to reflect some fairness and also accountability. So if you, we can certainly add, Mr. Smith, do you have a comment? Okay. So we could, if you want to vote on that, we can, we have a 2-to-1 vote that we make all 3.5 whatever a loan, and that we get that back hopefully in the first quarter of next year. Okay. And then one thing, I'd like to get some clarity on attachment 12 as to this coming fiscal year, where those numbers and resos should come out, because I understand that the 10% or the 10% cut this year put them in some difficulty, but what we had an expectation is that difficulty would be addressed by them reducing their budget, as opposed to waiting to the last quarter and saying that we just couldn't get the attrition. So we'd certainly like to start the new fiscal year with knowing what their numbers are and what they should be, and so that if they're going to grow into them or if they've maxed them out, we'd have some idea where we are. Is it 901? Is it 930? so that we have some ideas we go through.
I believe it's 909.
Yeah. So,
I think what we will do this for all departments, actually, in the first FSR is when we lay out the employment authority, both with regular positions and with the resos, and if there are any subs, that we'll make sure it's very clear for all what their actual authorities are, and certainly how they match up with the dollars that were provided.
And then also we'd ask that the first FSR that you make some note that we've either recovered the $2 million from the proprietaries and the 1.8 from the Consumer Trust Fund, that you comment as to whether that money has been received.
We will, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions on, let me ask you one other thing. CAO, you did a report recently on the funds that dealt with the consumer funds coming in. Did we adopt that
Yes.
as part of the budget?
Oh, as part of the budget, yes. Council adopted the idea that any type of, well, actually what we did is we brought those funds on budget. So it's part of their department budget now.
So there's
One
more
point-
clarity as to what's coming in
Yeah.
and how it's being
So
expended.
consumer protection funds will be paying for a portion of salary costs and related costs.
Okay. So that's already been approved.
Yes.
Yes, next fiscal year, if I may, it's allocated $3 million of 17,200 funds. This fiscal year, we're actually going to bring in $5.2 million, but $1 million of that was taken for P3.
Okay. All right. So with those directions, we'll move on to the next department.
I'm sorry, for clarity, so the committee's approving the request for the 1.87 million
We're
loan?
approving the request for 1.8 and 1.7, but they're being classified as loans.
And the 1.7 is a report it's a report from the chairman of the committee, because I think that requires 3 votes. And that was 2 to 1.
We have a quorum. Mr. Smith is still here. And so it's 2 to 1.
So it requires 3 votes for action by the committee, because
We
it's
do.
a 5-member
1,
committee.
2, 3. It's just that it's split.
So there's no action by the committee other
No, it
than...
is. We have a quorum here.
You have a quorum for action. In order to take an action, you need 3 votes to take an action.
Yeah. We have 3 votes, 2 to 1.
You have 2 to 1.
Yeah.
So it's not an action. Not of the
You
committee.
need 3 approval.
Committee,
Correct.
yeah, committee report will not reflect that the committee voted.
It would be a recommendation from the chair.
Whatever.
Thank you.
Or we can take it on consent, what do you want?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next department.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, we're, next is city clerk. We have some, the department's going to complete the year within budget. We have some transfers from their as-needed account to salaries general to cover election staff as exempt from furloughs. We also have a transfer of $1.2 million from the as-needed account to cover a portion of the election account deficit. And then we also need an additional appropriation from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty of $400,000 to cover the remaining part of this deficit. Now, this is all for the election materials for the thick ballot that we reported in the third FSR. All right, CDD, the department is projected to complete the year within budget from grant sources. Just as a note, we have the adopted budget revenue estimates were reduced by $4.3 million as a result of the change in cap rate. The department has proposed to withhold another 2.7, resulting from a further reduction in revenue, and these offset payments were transferred for related costs for various grants. The reconciliation of prior year underpayments and overpayments for related costs is still an outstanding issue that we'd like to have addressed. Right now, we're recommending that we absorb the one-time reduction of $2.7 million, then that would allow that money to be available for reprogramming. But we do have a recommendation to instruct the department to facilitate a meeting between our office, the CLA, and HUD to develop a procedure to reconcile underpayments and overpayments.
Let me ask a couple of questions. We had asked a while back to have a CAO report regarding the cap rates, and we haven't seen that.
Okay.
I mean, has it been how long?
Councilman, I think it was last meeting, you asked for the report on, the overall report or just regarding CDD?
Well, we wanted overall report because we were concerned that historically we understand why the cap rate is set up for outside funding, but we're using it to fund projects between departments. And we'd ask to come back and give us some insight as to the cap report and what drives it, so that if Street Services is doing a task for Rec and Park, we're not charging them as though they are an outside grant.
Right. You had two requests. One was an overall request for the cap rates, and I think that was something that the CAO was going to be working on. And then separately, you had a request specifically with regard to the Community Development Department.
Because we held that over from this
That's
committee.
right.
Okay. But no, the larger one is I'm worried about. When do we see that? Is that, we've had 2 summers.
It was only one. I think it was only one summer, so we've got another one coming. We will be working on hopefully we'll have some little more time this summer, so we'll be working on that. But I do want to say,
Do you have any idea on timing?
Councilmember, if I could just say, there was a report issued about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, that gave a history of the cap, what goes into the cap, and why it's used, for the most part at the federal, for the federal grant and state reimbursements. It did mention that it is also used, for the internal purposes, but there is, that report.
That was the report that I think this
well,
committee...
I think that was the report that you wanted back, and we will go back and analyze to make sure that we don't have departments internally charging other departments a full cap. I don't believe that is the case,
That's
but
the report that
we will.
we asked to go back and reevaluate that segment of it. Because we understand the outside funding, but it just, many of us
internal.
had a concern about why are we charging, when we already have the overhead rates in our human services account, why are we charging one department human services rates and overhead when we've already funded it in another part of the budget? And I think one of my comments was I could understand if you had a project that created a new position, then yes, it should be funded with overhead and whatever. But if you're merely hiring a group of people that's already on the payroll, why are we paying their overhead as out of another department's budget? That's what we're trying to get to.
Councilmember, I will have to work with your staff to define the parameters of this report because, we've addressed different issues. I think one concern, of course, is consistency. We certainly don't want to undermine our ability to get reimbursement from the federal government by charging our internal rates, by saying there's a different rate. It's, it's cheaper or less expensive. If that's the case, then that's something the federal government could then come to and say, hey, look, So there's...
That's what we asked you to reconcile for us because we understand clearly the outside rates. Just didn't understand why we're using it internally. Okay. So if we can get some idea, like a year, if we can't get a month.
But we'll have it done this summer. Actually, by us focusing on really surveying departments and how we're charging internally, we'll be able to have that back.
August, July?
Yes. We'll have it before the break.
Okay, so we can get that back in August 2011.
Oh, you got to put the year in there?
So we'll ask for that larger report. And then on the smaller report, when do we have an expectation that's coming back on the CDD money? Because we have an idea when that's coming back.
Taylor from the CEO's office. We expect to have that for the next Budget and Finance Committee meeting.
Okay, so that's June 2011.
Yes.
Thank you. So we can expect that, okay, those 2 reports. Let me just comment on the issue of the retroactive pay that we're saying that was underfunded. One of the concerns I had when I read that is that about 3 or 4 years ago, we picked up that as part of the city's budget, we were absorbing a pretty good healthy amount of overhead in order for the block grant to move forward. In the last 4 years, we've tried to pare it down to where we're almost close to zero now. I just don't know whether you retroactively can go back after the budget has been approved over and over that we absorb that voluntarily. And so I would be concerned if we're talking about using 37-year money and going back and paying 35 or 34-year money overhead when we absorbed it in the budget. The other thing is we changed the timing of the block grant so that we could get it earlier and know what the block grant was asking for in advance of us approving the budget. And so, again, those are two factors that were put in place so that we wouldn't end up with a situation that at some point reflected that we were using general fund money to support the block grant. So I'm a little concerned if our intent is to go back and ask for repayment of those prior budget actions.
Yeah, I mean, going back to prior years to adjust those could be problematic, and I think that's something that needs to be sorted out as part of this whole cap discussion. But whatever we do, we want to make sure that we're doing it consistently so that it neither jeopardizes our block grant funds and at the same time we want to try to address the general fund issue, and these two probably collide at some point. So that all needs to get sorted out as part of this overall discussion of the cap rate and how it's applied and what needs to be done from year to year.
Okay. Will that be part of that report that's coming to us in June, that depth, or are we just dealing with that one report?
I thought the report was going to come back was going to address really just the block grant and sort of whether we can go retroactive and so forth. So
because I think there's another fear if we go forward on something and end up it being viewed as inappropriate, general fund takes the hit again.
That's right.
And so, and I think with the cap rate, if they're following it, was it 32 cap rate? They're following as directed by the controller, even though it's less money. It doesn't seem like we could have a lot to do with that because they're following what was published as the cap rate.
Yeah, and generally, as I understand the cap rate as it relates to the block grant, is that you have the cap rate calculated, and that's applied to the next year, and then you have a new cap rate, and that's applied again. So at some point, those corrections are made year by year. And there's an analogous situation because the federal government charges its own indirect costs. So there's a similar situation, and we just want to make sure that whatever we're doing here in the city is consistent.
All right. So we should get most of those answers on the report in June.
It should be in there, yeah.
All right. So, all right. Get those resolved. Thank you. Next department.
Okay, next we have the controller, where they're expected to complete the year with a balanced budget. We do have a recommendation to appropriate $13,000 from the reserve fund to the Building and Safety Trust account, and this is for a second refund for a permit cash bond. A previous refund was made to an individual who was not the rightful owner of the refund.
Okay. What's the phase 2 hiring plan? That's in your second sentence.
Once after phase 1.
Back in earlier this fiscal year, we asked the controller to look at their hiring for the entire fiscal year and give us a phased approach to hiring. And after phase 1, phase 2 has been on hold.
So this isn't the accountant issue?
No, that is not the account issue.
And actually, by holding the phase 2 hiring, that has created the salary savings needed to not only cover this year, but also produce the funds that will be reappropriated into next fiscal years for their audits.
So they're still holding that until next fiscal year?
The phase 2 hiring is on hold for the remainder of this fiscal year.
Okay, all right. Any other questions on controller? All right, next.
The next department is the Convention Center. There is a recommendation in this report to transfer $657,000. That has been amended in the addendum. We're appropriating only $557,000 because council had taken a motion to appropriate some of that funds. So that's been corrected. We also have an appropriation of $356,000 for ERIP costs, and these are special funded ERIP costs. And then we have a instruction to reduce appropriations to GSD for security services.
Okay. Let me ask you, we just did a motion for them on transfer of funds to make their payroll?
That's why we've amended this first recommendation.
Okay. So that's $100,000?
Yes, it's been reduced.
All right. So that's been reconciled.
Council, we have a couple recommendations to reappropriate funds and to do some corrections to real property trust fund.
Okay. Well, let me go back to the convention center.
Yes.
could you, we get a report back on, there's two items. One, I understand that we have, for the last 2 years, we're waiting for an RFP dealing with the concessions. And the other one is, I think the last item that this committee asked for some information on was the employee bonuses. So we've done the other two that we had a concern about. So we can get some report back and a time on those two. Okay, now we go to council.
Cultural Affairs, at the time that we received the information from the department, we couldn't include it, but at the time we thought the department would complete the year within budget, but that was the assumption they would receive $63,000 from the Community Development Block Grant funds, and it's my understanding that the department will not likely get that money. However, determination needs to be made whether they will be able to absorb this expense internally or whether additional appropriation will be required.
So you're, even though the information is late, you feel comfortable?
Right now, we are not comfortable making any recommendation at this point. So if we did something, it would have to be addressed later.
Okay. So when does it come to council next?
Tomorrow.
Okay. So we won't have it before then?
I hope so.
So you'll have it by council?
Claudia Aguilar with the CAO. If the CDBG funds are not appropriated to the department at that time with the comp plan, we can put in a motion to do the necessary transfers, but we're still determining whether the department will be able to absorb that money. We could do it as part of the comp plan.
Okay. Any comment?
Hi. Yes, as you know, we have been working with the mayor's office to try to get some CDBG funds to help us cover staffing costs, mostly part-time staff for the art centers and theaters that we're supposed to be finding partnership opportunities for, but the RFP has been delayed. Because of the cuts in CDBG funds that were imposed by Congress, we're kind of not too sure whether we're going to get those funds or not. But as Claudia said, we would be working with the CAO's office to make a number of internal transfers to make sure that we don't have any deficit situation, and we'd be happy to continue working with them and either with the mayor's office or through your offices to make sure that we're covered for the rest of the year.
Okay. So we won't know anything by tomorrow, but you'll resolve this
Yes.
between now and the end of the year?
Yes. Correct.
Okay.
Disability was not to, let's see, disability was only to be continued through mid-year. However, the department is now having a deficit just because their operations have continued. We had a $35,000 deficit projected by the third FSR that has been reduced to $5,500, for which they'll need an appropriation from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty.
And this is just a salary deficit?
It's just a plain old salary deficit.
Okay. You're going to give them a pass for $5,000?
I think so.
Not going to break the bank? Okay.
El Pueblo, the department will complete the year within budget. Emergency management should complete the year within budget. Employee relations should complete the year within budget. Ethics, same thing. Finance department should complete the year within budget. We do have a recommendation to appropriate funds from the TOT for the LA Tourism Marketing District, and we have a transfer of $4,000 for the controller's accounting resource pool.
Okay.
Fire department.
Let me ask this one thing. When we had in budget, any idea when we're going to get the report back on the finance department and their special funds that we asked for?
Maria Gutierrez with the CAO's office. Actually, we have a couple of report backs. We are currently working on the consolidation. The other item that we now are going to have to address, I believe your committee requested it the end of this month. We are working as best we can, as quickly as we can. That is the issue that we're going to look at next after we address consolidation. Okay. So we understand your interest in getting that back to you as soon as possible.
So consolidation is 1A, and the other one's 1B.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
And Councilman, I think you did ask for those to be done in concert, so to be done together.
All right. So we'll get 1A and B together then.
Not likely, sir. The fact of the matter is, just to be upfront, the fact of the matter is that the consolidation has a number of moving parts that require, the full attention of our office.
Could you give us a timeline to the clerk so we'll have an idea when those two reports are coming in?
Well, I think on the consolidation, the intent is to have everything set in motion for a July 1st implementation. But we understand that there's going to be ordinance that may take longer to actually have in place, and so we need to come up with some of the contingencies for the reality that the ordinances will not be in place by July 1st. And so what happens then? Do we have an interim treasurer? Do we have there's a lot of questions out there.
Okay, so but our goal is July 1st.
Our goal is July 1st for consolidation, but knowing that because of the ordinance requirements that it may come after that.
Okay. And then any idea on the special funds?
The special funds, not sure. I mean, I could just tell you that
It should be probably a relatively short report. We should have it done either conjunction with the consolidation or shortly thereafter.
Isn't most of it done, or at least the basis of it is part of the finances budget?
The special fund?
Yes.
No, I think it's just more, we need to sort of provide you some policy direction.
Can we squeak an August out of you?
Oh, yes, most certainly.
Okay. August 2011. Okay, next.
Okay, the fire department, they had an $8.6 million deficit projected for the third FSR. That's been reduced to $6 million. So we have some recommendations which include internal transfers to address part of the deficit. However, we do recommend a $6 million appropriation from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty to cover the constant staffing overtime account deficit.
How much of the $6 million is directly related to the failure to implement the budget?
I would say all of it.
All of it?
However, I just want to note that $230,000 of their internal savings in this report is addressing a coalition-caused deficit. So if you wanted to swap that around, you could say that $230,000 would be used to address their constant staffing overtime, and we could make $230,000 of the appropriation apply to the coalition shortfall.
I think I'd like to add that basically, the department was sort of hamstring to begin with this year. And actually, I think the department has done a good job to actually bring down their shortfall. I think we were expecting a little bit higher deficit actually year end. And actually, they have worked to actually bring it down somewhat. We're still giving them money, but they're a lot better off than where they were before. So.
Okay. All right.
Wasn't their fault.
Okay. The next department is General Services. In the third FSR, they were reported that they complete the year within budget. However, that does not include an ERIP obligation that they were directed to absorb. They are now reporting a deficit which includes the ERIP obligation as well as coalition costs. So we do have an appropriation recommended for that. That's about $2.38 million from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty for their salaries general account, of which only 1.5 is attributed to the coalition represented employees.
Okay. So the thing is, if we're consistent, the 1.5 is for the coalition. What's remaining would be a loan.
Right.
Okay. Let me ask you, one other thing is that we already had it in the UB for the volatile petroleum account. So
we did appropriate the UB money. The deficit's even larger than we thought. So we appropriated the UB money. We still had a $2 million deficit projected. That's actually closer to $3 million.
Mm-hmm.
They did get some fuel rebates, which we used to address a portion of that. We still need to appropriate money from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty for that. That's about, $1.3 million. And that's separate from the 2.3 that I gave you for their salaries account.
Okay. Let me just, colleagues, any questions on fire? I'm sorry, on general services?
Mm-hmm.
No questions for me, but I just want to point out, probably on all these votes, it'll probably be by a 2-to-1 vote, because I don't believe in holding them to to do this as a loan.
Okay. Let me just ask on fire department. I forgot to ask you on attachment 14. Where are we on those fees and new programs that are listed?
Oh, there was no change from the third FSR.
I mean, is there effort to make those come to conclusion during next fiscal year?
Yes.
Okay. Could we ask them for a report back to tell us on attachment 14 when we could expect those several programs to become
Okay.
a reality? I think there's 3 or 4 of them.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Also, with GSD, there's some other recommendations, one of which includes the reapproval to use $12 million in MICLA funds for the purchase of 73 vehicles. These are your equipment-type vehicles that are required for replacement per SCA QMD and Cal Air Resources Board.
Okay.
All right, the next department is housing. They have a special fund surplus of $5 million, and they are able to reprogram those funds. We do have transfers to their transportation expense accounts and to their administrative expense accounts for costs. ITA, they had a slight deficit projected for the third FSR. That's been eliminated, and they will complete the year within budget.
Okay. And also, I think we have a report back on their 5-year plan? Do we know where that is? Dealing with public access?
The joint committee, we have to schedule it for joint.
Okay, could we get that moving? Okay.
Just so you know, that there is an appropriation from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty. That's for the EAA reduced furloughs, and that was approved as part of the OP plan, but it was just included in this report instead of the third FSR. We also have a recommendation to reappropriate funds for the FMS project.
Okay, that's on page 29, the second asterisk. That's what
Yes.
you, okay.
And that was, in the third FSR, we appropriated that money to almost all the departments except ITA, so theirs is pending.
Okay.
Library, they have a deficit projected for the department, but there are recommendations to appropriate money from their library fund to cover those deficits.
Okay. Let me ask you on that ITA, that last asterisk, that FMS money is going to be spent specifically on FMS?
I believe everything's tied to FMS, but how it's tied to the actual systems project, if you look at the description here, they talk about building out of training space and other system enhancements and unforeseen needs.
Okay, so we're reappropriating, but it's all FMS
Yes.
related?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, the mayor's office, they have a transfer of $10,000 requested for the Ramona Gardens grid project, and then there's a technical correction. Neighborhood empowerment, the department has a year-end deficit projected, which will be eliminated with the transfer of prior year funds that's available within the trust fund to the department. And then we also have a note that there is a cash shortfall, which we had noted in the first FSR, which we had hoped to address with this new budget, but there were some actions which, with the adoption of the budget, that may create a shortfall of $1.5 million.
No, the actions in the budget were only about $90,000, so it didn't create a $1.5 million shortfall. The shortfall was already there.
I think part of it also stems from the increased encumbrances that have been taking place towards by the neighborhood councils at a higher rate than expected.
Delilah Pucha, CAO. Some of the actions also that considered was the allowance for neighborhood councils to encumber funds. So we're waiting for the department to finalize the amount that existing neighborhood councils are encumbering. And I believe we allowed them to encumber funds for capital projects. So they are submitting demand warrants and estimates which would increase or reduce the $2.5 million that we were supposed to roll over. In addition to the funds that we are allowing new neighborhood councils to roll over.
But they're going to explain that to us in a report to this committee.
The deadline that the department reported for neighborhood councils to submit all paperwork is June 16th. So until that date, we will not have an accurate accounting for what the amount should be. Recently, we were advised that because of our elimination or suspension of the rollover policy, neighborhood council spending has increased. So until that deadline, we cannot have an accurate account of what the amount would actually be.
Okay. Now, we were expecting a report back when they dissolved the operation and then brought it back. And we were supposed to get a report that reflects what is their recommendations for permanent status, and we've never seen that.
No, we did work with CD2 in that report, and they responded back that they were okay with the existing structure of the department. And
Yeah. I think you missed my point. We asked for the report for the budget, and they were supposed to report back. It wasn't supposed to be a closed conversation that they liked it. It was supposed to explain to the council what was going to be the future size and dollar allocation for the that operation, because we had actually eliminated it out of the budget, and it was brought back merely for temporary, what we were told. And then we were going to get a report that says, how does it finally look? And we never got beyond that.
Mr. Chairman, Terry Sauer with the CAO's office. In putting the budget together, the recommendations currently contained in the budget are the outgrowth of the discussions with CD2 and with the neighborhood councils. The current structure that is funded is what is anticipated to be the ongoing structure for the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. Additionally, with the suspension of the rollover policy and the diminution of the funding program to an annual allocation, and there will be less demand. So the current structure that's in the budget is what we, and in conjunction with the Education and Neighborhood Committee, believe to be the structure that will continue to be in place on a go-forward basis.
Okay, we were not advised. My impression, it was still interim while waiting for this report, and it kind of slipped through the budget year, and so we've been waiting for...
Mr. Chairman, in working with CD2 initially, I think it was the intention of the Education and Neighborhoods Committee to have a somewhat, they were looking for more sweeping change or perhaps a reorganization of both how the funding program worked and the department itself. I believe what happened as the committee process went through and as a result of their town hall meetings, the council office came to the conclusion that it was not feasible to implement a more sweeping change in terms of either how the funding program would be administered, whether you had some other governing body or some other larger governing body. And so, if you will, by default, and perhaps it's, we should have communicated that more formally than through the committee process.
Because I think my last recollection is when it was dissolved, it was that they were going to come back, approve this just till June 30th, and we come back with a recommendation on how the future should look. And no one's come back and said, we changed course.
Yeah, that is correct. There has not been a formal communication from the Education and Neighborhoods Committee.
But the future is going to look an awful lot like the past.
Yes, that is correct.
So we spent a year for nothing.
Well, again, the council office, and I don't want to throw any... In working with the council office, the results of their town hall meetings, and in working with us, it became obvious that it was not feasible to, implement a new structure.
But see, they don't make that decision. The council does, not a committee.
Right. And in putting the budget together, the recommendations in the budget represent our best professional judgment of what the structure of the department, if the department is to continue, what you have before you, what's included in the budget are the resources they need. In terms of the funding program, again, with the suspension of the rollover policy, that burden is relieved from the department. Additionally, neighborhood council elections are being postponed for a 2-year cycle for another 2 years while a study is done in terms of whether or not it should remain with the clerk. based on all of those factors, the recommendations that we brought forward to you through the mayor's proposed budget represent what we think the department needs, because you don't have those two things happening.
I would have just, because I think when we had the discussion, I think everyone I remember that spoke to, there was a timeline. We'll do this temporarily, come back.
Correct. And the process took much longer than we anticipated, and what we found ourselves up against was the budget development. And if we did not come back with a separate report stating what, I follow my sword and I am remiss in.
Okay. All right. We'll just be disappointed then.
I hate disappointing you. That just makes me sad.
No, I think somebody just had to tell us this is it. I mean, that's.
Again, as the staff we do staff that committee, and we should have come back with you with something more formal, and I apologize that that.
When I went through the budget process, I did not view that was the final version. I just thought it had taken so long, we're going to stay in place and run in place until.
At this point, based on, the discussions that have been ongoing in the policy committee, the structure that you have, we're not going to be recommending any substantial changes, because any expansion, there aren't the resources, and any contraction doesn't make it feasible. So you pretty much, that's the model you have.
Okay. All right. I'll just write final plan.
Final plan. Okay. And again, I will work with the policy.
So if the committee or actually the larger council desires some sort of final department, so to speak, perhaps we can include a request in this action to basically have, say, OCLA to work with
I think
whatever committee,
education
neighborhood,
we'll work with the staff and make sure that it's calendared for the committee within the next meeting, and we will come back to you with a formal report, because again, I'm remiss in it.
I'm just wondering whether timely and whatever is that there's something in the FSR that basically says that research has been done, and what was approved in 11-12 budget is their final plan. I mean, that's all we've been waiting for. We kept saying, when is it coming? So if that's the final plan and we've approved it in 11-12 budget, I think rather than go back and write an altogether different report just to say it's in the budget, I don't know whether that serves.
It's final, it's in the budget.
Yeah, just that you put a note in this report and say that study was done, is what was recommended in the 11-12 budget is the committee's final recommendation, and if people have an opposition to it, we can go from there. But I think we're just waiting to say that somebody was going to tell us, is this the end game, or if this was still being studied, and apparently it's been resolved.
Well, there has not been a formal communication from the policy committee.
No.
Based on the discussions that had gone on in the policy committee, and again, that's what the proposed budget reflects, or the adopted budget now reflects. And again, I apologize that we didn't come forward with something more formal.
Okay. But we can do it the easiest way without creating tons of paper. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, for the personnel department, we project the department will complete the year within budget with the approval of recommendations. And one of those, actually two of those recommendations are to reappropriate funds, about 3.5 for the links replacement system and $1 million for the alternative dispute resolution program. For planning, we have a year-end surplus in the salaries general account of $556,000. And we do have a transfer to the controller salaries as needed account for the accounting resource pool. For the police department, they had a deficit of $3.7 million projected for the third FSR, and that included the appropriation of $11.4 million from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty. The department is now projecting that they will complete the year with a surplus. So we do have a recommendation to transfer $900,000 from the sworn overtime account to the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainties to address deficit shortfalls elsewhere.
So we'd like to just applaud the department for doing a wonderful job, and actually, at year end, we actually get to take money from them.
Temporarily.
It's a first. It's a first.
We might have to pass some holy water around.
I'm sorry, that was $1 million to the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty.
Yeah.
Board of Public Works, the department will complete the year within budget. We do have a transfer from their salaries general account to overtime for billing. For ConAd, they're one of the departments that had a new deficit projected, so we do have an appropriation from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty. We recommend this, however, because this is for work performed for the LAWA construction program, so even though reimbursement may not be received this year, we do project it will be received in the following fiscal year.
Make a note of that in the next FSR that we received it.
BOE is projected to have a surplus of $3.5 million at the end of the year. We do have some reductions to recommendations to reduce salary appropriations. Bureau of Sanitation, they're another department with a recommendation from the appropriation from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty, and this is for the solid waste fee lifeline subsidy. We also have some expenditure corrections and other recommendations.
You know, one thing I didn't understand is that we put a cap on the subsidy,
Yeah.
and then we reduced it from 100% to 30%, and yet we're still showing a deficit?
My understanding, there was some delay in the cap and getting the ordinance to reduce the subsidy.
Timing problem.
Yeah, basically, Emilio Rodriguez Hill's office, the ordinance was expected to be in place by around August of 2010. Wasn't actually approved until November 9th, and the actual billing didn't start taking effect until January of this year.
Can we start charging the city attorney late charges for these ordinances getting here late and costing us money?
Let me have those dates again.
Ordinance was approved November 9th, 2010. To my understanding, the billing didn't take effect until January. This is a Water and Power's billing system.
Okay, now our expectation was that it can be August.
Council adopted the action to do the lifeline revision back in February 3rd. So we basically assumed 6 months from that time to have the ordinance actually in place with the billing in process.
Okay, all right.
Just to note, the third FSR had projected a deficit of about $3.6 million. It's really about 2.2, so we have recommendations to appropriate that fund and encumber it so it can be used, because the billings usually come in after the close of the fiscal year.
And we're in full swing now.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
And then in addition to all the other recommendations, we do have recommendations to reduce special fund money that was set aside in the ERIP, about $4.5 million. And that's the key. Any questions on sanitation?
Now go back on explain to me on we're reducing the special fund.
We had about $4.5 million set aside in the UB of special funds for ERIP payouts. Not all this money was required because they were able to absorb these costs with salary savings, so that funding is reduced. That's not going to be going to the department. There's also about $371,000 of this money in SPA money that will be used to reimburse related costs.
So they found within the internal resources 4.5.
That's correct.
I should say, Neil Guglielmo, Bureau of Sanitation. The Managed Hiring Committee helped us find that money as well.
That's the most positive thing you've said about the meeting. Thank you. All right.
Next department is Bureau of Street Lighting. The department is expected to have a special fund surplus of $2.2 million, and these will revert to their special funds at year end, which may be reappropriated. Street services, There is a separate addendum for this that we'll cover after we discuss all the recommendations in this report. We do have one recommendation to rescind a previous recommendation in the third FSR, which was for $1.9 million for projects. A majority of that funding was not available, about $1.3 million, so we're rescinding that recommendation in this report. Rec and Parks is projected to complete the year within budget. They do have a salary surplus of about $2 million. There is a $1 million shortfall in revenue for various reasons. Transportation is projected to complete.
But they compensate for that by, what, $1 million from their rec centers? So they kind of balance out?
My understanding is they'll actually have a surplus because there's more salary savings to offset the revenue shortfall. Transportation will complete the year within budget. We have various appropriations for different projects.
Let me just ask on transportation. General Services, in one of theirs, they had a request for some funding that dealt with some parking lot needs.
Yes.
Is that something that transportation could absorb in their first year transportation report? It was like a couple $100,000 or something.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
There's, in General Services report, they reflect that they needed, I think it was a couple $100,000.
There was $235,000 recommended from transfers
parking.
from other accounts to purchase parking equipment for Civic Center.
Just wondering, could that become a part of the fund, the first year of LADOT's 5-year operational plan and absorb that?
I'm not sure right now, but we can get you the information before
Could you look at
tomorrow.
that and see if that's something that can be a part of their funding, and with General Services and the financial situation, any little bit helps them?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
So the last one of the recommendations in transportation is a $3 million that were set aside in the UB reserve that's now being recognized to reimburse general fund costs for street services. Treasurer, they're expected to complete the year within budget. However, for their expense account for bank fees, we did note in the third FSR that we were projecting a deficit. They have revised their bank fee expenditures to $10.8 million. They received an appropriation in their budget of $4.9, and they've received subsequent appropriations from reimbursements in the third FSR, and that left a bank fee shortfall of about $3.3 million. Council has a pending report, or it's been approved, for $1.2 million of additional appropriations, which is backed by reimbursements. However, they still have a $2.1 million shortfall that needs to be appropriated from the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty, and these would cover the general fund related bank fee costs.
And we're still looking at the whole issue of bank fees, whether they are appropriate or whether they can be reduced?
I believe so, and for next year's budget, I think what was proposed and what was adopted is I believe close to $9 million in the Office of Finance for bank fees, so it's getting closer to the actual amount, and I believe that review is going to help us determine what will be the actual amount.
Steve Leonard, City Treasurer. Councilmember, I want to make sure that everybody understands the fact that the bank fees that the city incurs is as a result of activity by all the other city departments, and Treasury really has it acts kind of like as a conduit to make sure that these bills are paid. You asked a question whether or not there's a way to reduce the bank fees. It's very minimal if we can. I'm already talking to the banks right now to see if they can reduce the cost. But majority of that cost is actually not the regular bank fees that we all know. Majority of it is actually charged by third parties like Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and pretty soon we'll be adding Discover. So the cost of banking has actually been rising in the city here relative to the number of functions or departments who are currently adding more credit card capabilities. So the more they do that, the higher the bank fees will actually go. And so to say that we'll be able to reduce that, it's going to be difficult. In the past, we had a higher balance in the bank, and it allowed us to accumulate some credit. We stopped doing that because it was more beneficial for us to invest our own money than the amount of than the credit that we were receiving from the banks. I don't know if that answers your question.
The thing is that we just asked as the merger goes forward, they keep looking at that whole area of seeing how we can reduce those fees. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, the zoo is expected to complete the year with a surplus of $600,000, but we recommend holding that money to address any shortfalls of revenue or any operational maintenance needs. And then we have an additional section which the narrative has been replaced in our addendum to finalize the consolidation of previously eliminated departments. So those include transfers and moving funds under different departments.
Okay.
So that concludes the department narrative. The non-departmental narrative begins on page 42 with the CAP Finance Fund. We have a recommendation to transfer $1.5 million in MICLA funds to U.S. Bank to partially pay for debt service for the Police Administration Building. For GCP, we have identified additional savings from the Social Security and pension savings accounts, $400,000 to transfer to the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty to address shortfalls elsewhere. We have a similar surplus of $500,000 identified in the Police Health and Welfare Program account under the Human Resources Benefit Fund, and another $200,000 in the Fire Health and Welfare account. And these would both go to the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty. And we also have an update on the liabilities claim account where we have a $1 million surplus projected for the fund. And then our final recommendations for non-departmental accounts are in the UB section on page 44. We have a transfer of $6,500 from the UB Reserve to Fire and Police Pensions Funds to pay for the 1% Tier 5 contribution. And then we have transfers of additional savings that were identified as part of the operational plan to the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty. Oh, and then there's one more recommendation, on page 45, and this is unencumbering and transferring about $16 million in funds that were previously appropriated to pay water and electricity costs for rec and parks. The department's going to be paying that directly. So if you'd like to go on to the addendums.
Okay. Well, one question on the we'll get to the addendum. Okay. I want to ask a question on attachment 12. Okay. All right.
Yes. You said you wanted to ask a question?
We're going with one. When you get to 12, I have a question.
Oh, okay, so you wanted to go through the rest of the report before we went to the FSRs?
No, I thought you were going to go through the attachments.
Okay, so really quick on the... So attachment 1A is our revenue outlook, and that hasn't changed since the proposed budget from the mayor's office. 1B just shows the changes from budget and the changes from the third FSR. So, but that revenue shortfall is still the $75 million. Attachment 2 is our reserve fund. And I reported on that previously that it had increased to 193. Attachment 3, that's been changed per the addendum. So right now, we currently project a surplus, a citywide surplus of $218,000. And that, what we have is the department shortfalls and non-departmental shortfalls that were identified and the appropriation from the UB Reserve to those departments to address and help them complete the year within budget. And after all these transfers...
You say that on attachment 3 that there's a change, or that,
Yes, if you look at the addendum, we've revised that to show the changes with, it's only a slight dollar amount from the MOU 3 changes. So I believe the year-end figure, I think he's looking at the original.
did we get an amended 3?
Yes.
I thought we had that.
You have an amended 3 in your addendum.
Oh, we got a 6 and 16.
It's in this package here.
Oh, that one here.
So just to make things complicated, that amended attachment 3 in the addendum has been amended again because we have a correction that we've submitted to the clerk to appropriate additional funds for animal services that I'll touch on when we discuss the addendum.
Okay. You've lost me on one of those.
I'm terribly sorry.
There's an addendum dated May 27th. It says addendum to the 10-11 year-end financial status report. And in that addendum, there's a attachment 3 that's been revised.
Oh, I got it, this one.
On May 20th. No, we just got this. So follow along with this. This is Erica's version.
No, it's not. That's a different date.
So you're referencing the May 27th?
That is correct, but if you didn't make it, I can certainly provide another one to council tomorrow.
Okay. And so, I see now, you're saying this attached to the May 27th report
Yeah.
is the new attachment 3?
Correct.
Okay. With you now.
And what's been changed is to show additional appropriations.
So it drops from 412 to 248?
That's correct.
All right. All right. Okay.
Attachment 4 are the recommendations for new appropriations. Attachment 5 are recommendations to transfer within department funds. Attachment 6 are recommendations to transfer funds between, monies between departments and funds. Attachment 7 are appropriations from the unappropriated balance. So we've called these out during our discussion, and these include the monies for the coalition, reduced furlough savings, as well as deficits for departments that weren't able to be solved, and expense shortfalls like the bank fees, solid waste fee, lifeline subsidy, petroleum account, and election. Attachment 8 are transfers to the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty with regards to additional savings that were identified. Attachment 9 is the fleet equipment replacement list that GSD has proposed to purchase with the approval to reauthorize the $12 million in funds. Attachment 10 is the transfer to consolidate department funds with the elimination of the Human Services Department. Attachment 11A just refers to the UB general account and the status, so there's about $5,000 left remaining in that. Attachment B shows the appropriations for all other accounts, including the third page, which shows the transfers in and out of the UB Reserve for Economic Uncertainty and the ending balance of $75 million, which will cover the shortfall of the revenue shortfall. Attachment 12 is the one that you had questions on, which is our employment level report.
I just was going to ask, when we show these positions on the chart as unfilled, the vacancies, are those the same positions that was referenced in the budget that moved to the Brown Book?
Well, now, the Brown Book would just cover the proposed budget, so this is the current fiscal year position.
I'm just wondering, is there a correlation between the Brown Book or 1112 and this list of vacancies that's on?
Only in that if the position status didn't change for those departments, so if they had carried the same regular and resolution authorities through, but other than that, there's not really any correlation.
Okay.
Attachment 13 is the status of the voluntary furlough program. It shows about $1.8 million, but only 53% of that savings is general fund related savings. And attachment 14, which is the status of fee increases, that has not changed since our third FSR. And attachment 15 is the mayor's office update on their grid program. And we do have an attachment 16 that's part of an addendum.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a quick question back on attachment 13? The voluntary furlough program, I presume, was done primarily under mandatory furloughs at the same time. Are we anticipating a larger number in voluntary furloughs in the coming year with most of those mandatory furloughs eliminated?
You know, I cannot speak to that. I mean, certainly we can find out that information and report back unless somebody else is here to answer.
At this time, I don't have a good answer for you. We are, though, extending the voluntary program into next year. I would imagine we'll end up with the same amount of savings, but here it's too early for us to really tell. You're looking at participation by those people in the different MOUs and departments. We would hope you would get.
In theory, people that actually liked having the furlough time could put in for some voluntary furlough time. So while I wouldn't budget on it, it's certainly possible that it's a substantially higher number next year.
Perhaps.
Okay, so would you like to begin on the addendums?
So that,
Would you like to discuss the addendums, which have additional recommendations for departments?
and that's on the recommendations?
We have an addendum that was released with regarding the Bureau of Street Services that has some recommendations for transfers. And then our office also released a subsequent addendum to address the coalition shortfalls with MOU 3, as well as some other recommendations that were received. So the Street Services one.
That's item 1 that's dated 5/20.
Yes.
Okay.
So they had recommendations for transfers and appropriations totaling $2.9 million. And then there was an additional request to reappropriate $1.5 million in ARA funds.
So these are all internal.
These,
Good afternoon, committee members. John Chavez with the CAO. Councilman, no, these would actually be coming from, in some cases, CRA, for instance, or LAWA, and be going into their departmental accounts to do various street services related projects.
All right. Okay. And your other addendum is May 27th.
we have another addendum that was released May 27th, and that includes new and corrections to the previous one. So these include the $100,000 reduction for the convention centers for the previous action taken by council. We have some technical corrections for account names and recommendation language. We have a new recommendation for the mayor's office to transfer $84,000 in JAG funds to the city attorney to pay for current year costs. We have a recommendation to transfer $15,000 from the Department of Water and Power to the Personnel Department for background investigations. And we have new transfer recommendations for transfers between accounts for Office of Finance, General Services, Police, and Bureau of Engineering, and to appropriate funds from the Reserve for Economic Uncertainty for Animal Services and the City Attorney's Office. This is for the Coalition MOU 3 agreement, and we have submitted a revised handout to go with that, because we've added additional appropriations to animal services and an additional transfer for GSD to cover MOU 18. So that will be included in, I believe, the report. And then finally, we have a $340,000 transfer from the mayor's office salary accounts to the salaries and needed account to pay for staffing, and that covers the recommendations in the addendums.
Let me ask you, on this end of year, what's the status of our Schedule H? Have we resolved all of those issues for this budget?
I believe we, at least with regard to the ordinances, I think all those were complete. There may have been some outstanding reports. I don't have it with me, but what we can do as we go back into the new fiscal year, we can give an update and just do a cleanup on the current year ones if you'd like.
And what about that report on resolution authorities? Did we ever get a report back?
I think that's pending the committee here.
So it's in the committee?
It's pending, yeah, in your committee.
I mean, so we just have to schedule it? When you say pending, it's...
Yeah, we came before you,
Okay.
I think, yeah,
All right,
so we're
we'll get to that.
waiting for you to...
And then the last thing I had is on the MICLA report. We're supposed to get a report from the CAO about our transition and usage of MICLA.
Yes.
And so...
Okay, we'll come back.
Is that in our future?
Yes, it is.
Somewhere soon?
We will bring it back before the break.
Before the break, okay. All right. You have any questions? Right.
Let's read my notes to see if there's anything that hasn't been asked. The only question that wasn't resolved, well, maybe was asked, on the city attorney utilizing a transfer from the salaries grant reimbursed accounts to salaries general, is it legal to do that?
That is a general fund appropriation that will not be reimbursed for grant funds. The city attorney's office will not be working on grant projects with that transfer to the salaries general account.
That's the only thing I had left.
Nothing else.
Okay. Then we have a document that goes to the clerk from the CLA on some corrections as it relates to the controller transferring. We'll give you that. And so there's no other questions. We have no cards. We will basically forward this to the council with the amendments and recommendations of the committee, and this will be scheduled for tomorrow. Okay? So thank you very much. We'll adjourn.
I really thought about it since I have this community here, just got shown up.